Foods that we choose to eat can have a profound net impact on our mental health. Anxiety is the number one mood disorder in the United States. Number two to that is depression. Beef, pork, etc., that use Skittles to fatten the cattle.
What?
Before they go to slaughter. And what's interesting is the exact researchers who understand the way that seed oils damage at the cellular level, they're not being invited to these big conferences to speak. They're not being invited. It's the industry researchers that are being invited to validate the safety and efficacy of these oils. The friends of mine that did consume raw milk or they gave it to their children, it was this very kind of clandestine, behind the scenes experience because a lot of these farmers can get prosecuted.
That's crazy.
Right. And so understanding what happens with the sterilization of milk, how it destroys a lot of the beneficial properties, I promise you will eat a lot less processed food. Just eliminating seed oils can have a profound net impact on our health in really substantial ways. We don't manage our stress, and certainly the pandemic, for me personally, has just demonstrated how poorly we manage stress as a culture. For so many people, they assume when they go to the grocery store in the United States, they assume if something's there, it's healthy. And I would be the first person to argue that you should think exactly the opposite. I don't see enough people talking about that. It is imperative. And so for him, every time we went to a party, we'd have to say he cannot have any red dye. Because when he consumes red dye, and he would say to me, Mommy, I can't control my body.
Let me properly introduce you, Cynthia. So Cynthia Thurlow is a globally recognized expert in nutrition and intermittent fasting, highly sought after speaker and the CEO and founder of Everyday Wellness Project. She's been a nurse practitioner for 20 plus years and is a two-time TEDx speaker. Her viral TEDx talk, Intermittent fasting transformative technique, has been viewed over 7 million times. She has been featured on ABC, Fox 5, KTLA, CW, and in Medium and Entrepreneur. She's also the host of Everyday Wellness Podcast, which was listed as 20 podcasts that will help you grow in 2020 by Entrepreneur magazine. It is her mission to educate and inspire and empower. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
If you can, a little bit closer to the mic. So, Cynthia, since I am obviously a foreigner, I'm an immigrant, so I'm from Lithuania. Lithuania is a very small country, right? So we have 2.5 million people population only. And just to give you a little bit of stats, so Lithuania population up to 3 million, right? Guess how many McDonald's do we have in the whole country?
Oh, I'm embarrassed to guess maybe a couple hundred.
Nope, 17.
Oh.
Yes. So, for instance, Los Angeles population up to 4 million. And the count of McDonald's is 319.
That's so disappointing.
Yeah. So, when I was living in Lithuania, I was obviously watching the Hollywood movies, and I saw those big people that you have here in the U.S. I'm like, there's no way these are the real people. The first time I got to the U.S. in 2018, I was like shocked, amazed. And we went to Venice Beach, to Santa Monica, and even there are huge big people. It was like, there's no way these people are real. How do you think that is? Why do you think that there is, especially only in the U.S.? Because prior to that, you told me you've been to Portugal. You will never see this kind of obese people in Europe, right?
I think it's multifactorial, meaning I think there's multiple reasons that are contributing. And it would go without saying that I think nutrition is really at the crux of the problem. We know that 70% of Americans consume ultra-processed food every day, and most of them are consuming it for all of their meals. So ultra-processed foods are definitely a contributing factor. I think that the rise of the utilization of seed oils, and this is something that I'm literally in the midst of prepping for a podcast to talk specifically about this, the rise of these ultra-processed, deodorized, highly inflammatory seed oils, which proliferate in the processed food industry. I think the utilization of non-nutritive sweeteners, those are the aspartame, sucralose, I think those are absolutely contributing. And then you also think about just our lifestyles. Most people are physically sedentary. They are not actively moving their bodies on a regular basis. And on top of that, we live in a culture that has instant gratification. We can get anything we want any time of the day or night. And so that means we're not sleeping. We're not getting good quality sleep. we don't manage our stress, and certainly the pandemic, for me personally, has just demonstrated how poorly we manage stress as a culture. And the other piece of it that I think contributes is that we're starting to see these multi-generational obesity problems. So it's not just one generation that's problematic. We have families that are having children, and we know that we can get epigenetic changes, so changes that can be conferred and passed along to offspring that are a direct reflection of the poor nutrition. And I would also argue that we are a culture that is grossly under-muscled, and we know that muscle is this incredible organ of longevity, a la Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, but really speaking to the fact that as we are becoming less metabolically healthy, as we are losing muscle mass, we are exacerbating this problem. And you're correct. We were just in Portugal, and it was something that really stood out to me, just as not only as a human being, but as a mom and a wife, how the United States has unfortunately positioned itself to be one of the leaders in poor metabolic health internationally.
But you see, the problem is that when you see an obese person here in the US that weighs, for instance, 300 or even more pounds, I'm thinking, how is it even physically possible? Like the shape that those people have, it's definitely not only the food. I mean, if you take, for instance, there are multiple pictures on the internet, for instance, Skittles in the US and the Skittles in the UK or Europe. So the ingredient list is like twice as big in the US. Like, why? If you can make the same product with the less ingredients, why do you invest more and pay more for more ingredients? There is some kind of a purpose for this.
Well, I think it's also here in the United States, food manufacturers get away with a lot more. They're not held to the same standards as what is done in the UK or the EU, as an example. And so I think that absolutely contributes. And we talk about Skittles, and you may know this story, but there are a lot of farmers that are doing conventional raised beef, pork, et cetera, that use Skittles to fatten the cattle.
What?
Before they go to slaughter. Yes, you can actually Google this, any of your watchers or listeners. There was a truck carrying an overwhelming amount of Skittles that actually got into an accident. So the Skittles were all over the highway. And when they asked where he was taking this voluminous amount of Skittles, they identified it was going to a feedlot. And so understanding that not just grains, but also candy, things that are discarded by the processed food industry are designed to fatten the exact animals that we are purchasing in many instances in our grocery stores that we are then consuming. So we have diseased, metabolically unhealthy animals which are being slaughtered, which we then go on to eat and consume. And I'm the first person to say that the quality of the food we eat matters. And this is a great example of that. So you speak to the ingredient list being different, and it's because in the United States, there is not enough legislation to protect consumers. So consumers have to protect themselves.
But why feed cows with the Skittles? It's too expensive. You just feed
it's cheap.
With
it's
sugar.
Cheap. Yeah, it's cheap. It's a cheap way to feed them. We know that if you processed carbohydrates in general are going to raise your glucose levels, which will then raise your insulin levels. And when insulin is high, you are in a fat storage state. So yes, it's a cheap, inexpensive way to fatten animals prior to slaughter. And I'm not suggesting this happens all the time, but there was certainly some interesting news stories that came out of that experience. And certainly for me, it gives you pause. You just understand that regenerative agriculture is very different than traditional, conventional agriculture here in the United States. And there's many reasons for that. A lot of it's economic. But I think for a lot of individuals, farming is hard business. And I think a lot of farmers, understandably, are trying to, limit the amount of financial impact of the quality of the food that they are feeding these animals throughout their lifetime.
But what's crazy is, for instance, if you take 30 years ago, the media was just demonizing, for instance, the eggs, right? Then after a few years, I want to say after a decade, the eggs are good. Now, after another decade, the eggs are bad, just like 20 years ago. And if you're just a consumer, if you're just a regular, average Joe, you have no idea, is it good or is it bad? But if you take, for instance, if you go to a grocery store right here in the US, you see all those, like you said, foods that are just prepared. You take it to the microwave for 2 minutes and you're good. And why not? But then you take the ingredients list, and I can't even pronounce the names of the ingredients. But people consume this every day.
Well, I think we've convinced consumers,
That
just
is
like
good.
my patients, well, not just that we are incapable of having the time to either learn how to cook or how to prepare nutrient-dense foods, or even how to make a nutritious meal. We've really left that to the hands of the processed food industry. And I would argue, you alluded to, fats being bastardized and how that whole culture came about. In the 1950s, when Eisenhower, who was then president, had a heart attack, there was a gentleman, a researcher by the name of Ansel Keys. And so he really was at the crux of demonizing fats at the expense of sugars. And so that 7 studies country, the cherry picking of data, that was the beginning of this fat bastardization, where people went from consuming butter and not being concerned about saturated fat to suddenly demonizing those foods and really starting to shift attention and reflection to fat at the expense of understanding that, when you take fats out, people oftentimes are not satiated. And so they continue eating and eating and eating. And so I think on a lot of different levels, it has contributed to a lot of the misinformation that has gone on over the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and has certainly contributed to the metabolic disease and obesity epidemic that we're dealing with now.
So the sugar lobby.
The sugar lobby, it's a subsidized food here in the United States. The 3 big things are soy, corn, and sugar beets. And so anything that benefits those subsidies, you're going to see proliferate in the processed food industry. And you start to understand this interrelationship between government and public industry, private industry for that matter, and how that's impacted our health. And I think for so many people, they assume when they go to the grocery store in the United States, they assume if something's there, it's healthy. And I would be the first person to argue that you should think exactly the opposite. Not as a means of fear-mongering, not as a means for people feeling paranoid, but as a growing awareness that the more you know, and I always say it's a rabbit hole. Once you've gone down the rabbit hole, you can't get back out. If you look for just one ingredient every time you purchase something in the grocery store, I promise you will eat a lot less processed food. Just eliminating seed oils can have a profound net impact on our health in really substantial ways. But you just start to realize soybean oil is the #1 consumed fat in the United States, not avocados, not butter, not nuts, but soybean oil.
But not intentionally.
Correct.
You get the soybean oil, all the vegetable oils, just because you take potato chips, for instance.
Correct. I mean, it was interesting. There's a colleague of ours that has a podcast in the LA area as well, and he on Insta Stories mentioned there was a food truck, and on the side of the food truck it said no seed oils, and I was like, that's brilliant, because people that know are going to drive their business towards that kind of business. And so I oftentimes will indicate to people that if you just eliminate one thing, not anything else, not gluten, not dairy, not processed sugars, just eliminate the seed oils, your world is going to get a lot smaller.
But why it became a common thing, the seed oils, only, I want to say, 5 years ago max? Why no one was talking about it like 20 to 30 years ago?
Well, it's interesting. So Dr. Kate Shanahan, she's a medical doctor, but this has become, she started as a biochemist in a PhD program and then realized she could make a larger impact going to medical school. And she was talking about how even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was such little information. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is the exact researchers who understand the way that seed oils damage at the cellular level, they're not being invited to these big conferences to speak. They're not being invited. It's the industry researchers that are being invited to validate the safety and efficacy of these oils. So I think that there's a twofold issue. I think that there's been a concerted effort to control the narrative and to control that information. And then I think that there have been, researchers and physician colleagues like Dr. Kate Shanahan as an example, who are trying to amplify this. She calls it the hateful eight. And I think it's important for people just to be aware. And I think it can also be very disappointing. It can be very upsetting because there are probably foods you love eating, if you're listening, that you're going to go, well, now I need to find an alternative. And sometimes the alternatives are more expensive.
Yes.
And so it becomes this huge domino effect. And then you add into that as another example, if these oils get heated, they're more toxic. So you think about it when you go to McDonald's. if anyone that's listening goes to McDonald's.
It's
If you go to McDonald's, those fryers over and over and over again, you look at animal model data that certainly suggests the toxicity gets exponentially increased when those oils are heated over and over and over again. It's incredibly disappointing as a clinician to understand that we have been hoodwinked, not just as a clinician, but as a nation, that there's this lack of amplification of this message because it's inconvenient. People don't want to have to find alternatives. You know, we've been convinced that vegetable oils, which are polyunsaturated fatty acids, we've been convinced that these should be at the crux of our diets.
Omega-6.
Yes. And we need some omega-6. We need more omega-3s. And so this pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory amplification of inflammation, which is already at the basis of most of our health issues, it requires a bit of effort. And I think for a lot of people, it's very hard to wrap their heads around making substantial and significant lifestyle changes. And in fact, sometimes when I have these conversations, people get angry because they'll say, well, I can't afford to do X, Y, and Z. And then I would just say, eat less of it. Be aware of it. Understand when you go to a restaurant, your salad dressings, your $100 steak. There's a very well-known steakhouse in the LA area, and someone mentioned to me, you realize, like, yes, that's a grass-fed steak, but you know what they cook your grass-fed steak in?
No way.
Seed oils.
Why?
Because it's cheap. It's cheap.
It's $100 steak.
Correct. They're ruining it by cooking it in seed oils. And in fact, I have sometimes gotten to the point when I go to dinner, when I'm at business events, and I will say to myself, I'm either going to enjoy my meal or I'm going to think about what I'm eating that I don't want to be eating. And so more often than not, in those circumstances, I try to deflect attention from where my brain is going. But because we rarely eat out, I look at it as it's probably not doing the same amount of damage that it would do if someone else was doing that repetitively day after day, multiple times a day. And so the message is clear. Read your food labels. Read your food labels.
So you by saying that people can't afford more healthier food is a myth, because, for instance, if you take a steak, if you eat a steak, you're going to be full for 3 to 4 hours, right? And the steak is pretty much, it's pretty expensive, but you're going to be full for 3 to 4 hours.
Right.
It's nutrient dense. The protein is in steak is incredible, the best there is.
Well, one of the things I will tell people is, yes, the steak is expensive, but ground meat is cheap.
Yes.
So if you can't afford the steak, I get it. And I understand some of the leaner cuts of steaks are more expensive than the fatty ones. Ground meat is inexpensive, and that's a very nutrient-dense option. And so I always say, start getting creative. Start thinking about the things that you can change, things that you can do that will have a large net impact. My teenagers will eat 2 pounds of ground meat in a sitting, which is terrifying.
2 pounds of meat in the...
Just understand, your little guy will eventually be eating enormous amounts of protein. Like, I jokingly tell my husband, it's going to be interesting to see what our grocery bills are like when they're both in college. Having said that, I think that people will say it's an economic issue. And I do understand that. And that's when I'll say, listen, there's Environmental Working Group. They have the Clean 15, the Dirty Dozen, fruits and vegetables worth purchasing organic versus not, versus conventional. That's one way to navigate things. It's also, you buy the best quality you can afford. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not asking anyone to go into debt. I'm not suggesting that. That would be really irresponsible of me to suggest otherwise. But what it really speaks to is eat less processed foods. Because when you're eating less processed foods, you're eating real food. You're eating that steak or the ground meat. You're probably having some vegetables. Gosh, I think fruit has been demonized, which I think is really upsetting. I'd rather you have a piece of fruit than sit down and eat a candy bar. And let's not even get started on protein bars as an example of things that are marketed to be super healthy, but in most instances really are not.
So let's go point by point. So let's start with the seed oils. How did you mention it? Angry 8?
So it's called the Hateful Eight.
Hateful Eight.
Yeah, so
What
that's
is that?
Dr. Kate Shanahan's coined phrase. It's looking at the big ones: soybean, cottonseed, canola, sunflower, safflower. I'm forgetting a few, but I'll pull them up for you so that you have them available. But it's really looking at the ones that we most see. And obviously, soybean is number one. Then I would say I see sunflower the most when I'm looking at food labels, probably safflower next. And the unfortunate thing is they're used in like nuts. So you think you're purchasing or picking up. I was on the airplane yesterday and they were passing out the bag of junk. But actually, they actually did pass out pistachios that were just salted. So I grabbed those and said, okay, I'll just take them in case I need them. But they had another bag of nuts. And I flipped over the ingredient list, and the gentleman next to me was asking me, why are you looking at the ingredient list? I was like, I'm always curious. Second ingredient was sunflower oil. And I just politely put it back. He said, why didn't you take that? And I said, well, if you understand what seed oils do in the body, you would try to avoid them. That's all I'm going to say. Like, if you choose to eat them, understand that they do have a negative net impact on the body. And I think for so many individuals, the simple act of reading a food label can make such an enormous difference in just building awareness. Maybe you're not ready to make the changes, but then you start to understand they're everywhere.
So seed oils is basically omega-6?
Right. They're they're ideally they are taken from a seed that in and of itself, like sunflower seeds aren't bad.
Yes.
That's not intrinsically a bad thing. But in order to get it from a seed into a liquid form, it has to go through bleaching. It sometimes goes through hexane gas extraction. And sometimes the processed food industry has gotten so savvy, if they don't use hexane, if they use something else, they can call it organic. So this extraction process is this multi-step process, which I'm in the midst of reading about right now. It's probably 5 or 6 steps to get it from the seed to get it to an oil. It's deodorized. It's exposed to chemical solvents. It's exposed to things we don't want in our bodies. If you want to be fascinated/disturbed, Google on YouTube canola oil creation.
I saw that video.
It is disgusting. And yet we are using this, and they deodorize it. They make it a pretty yellow color so that it makes it more appealing. There's a lot that's done to manipulate that oil to make it look healthy, and it's anything but.
And it's still 100 times cheaper than the olive oil? That's why they use it?
Right. Real olive oil is very expensive. Even avocado oil, which I'm starting to hear rumblings that some of the avocado oil that's out there actually isn't avocado oil, which is disturbing. So I always say pick a good brand. Same thing with olive oil. But, understand there's a lot of options for cooking. For baking, it does not necessarily have to involve the seed oils.
So in the human's body, there has to be a good balance of omega-3s, 6, and 9s, right? When you consume a lot of vegetable oils, you get a lot of omega-6.
Correct.
And not the right amount of omega-3s.
Correct.
That's the problem. That causes inflammation.
Correct. So what we want is omega-3 fatty acids are designed to be anti-inflammatory. Omega-6s are pro-inflammatory, but what we want is balance. And understanding at a very basic level in the human body, we want a balance of pro-inflammation is not necessarily a bad thing. Like if you fall, you break a bone, you cut yourself, you want some degree of inflammation because that sends in chemical messengers in the body to help heal. It's chronic inflammation that becomes problematic. So when we're looking at finding a balance, I was always taught it should be 1-to-1. That's not realistic. Most people don't even eat the right amount of fatty fish or consume those foods. I find there are a lot of people that will consume like chia seeds, flax seeds. Well, that's great. Having said that, right now in the United States, the ratio that I've seen is a 20-to-1. 20 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. So a lot of inflammation and very little de-inflammation. And so helping people understand that there is this balance in our bodies. So we do want to have, like, as an example, if you eat fatty fish, they talk about smash fish. So salmon, mackerel, anchovies, etc. For some people in the United States, those are some of the stronger, oilier fish, but those are the ones that have the most omega-3s in them. But if you eliminate seed oils, or you're at least aware of the seed oils, or you're not purchasing them, or you're reading food labels, you're going to bring down that inflammation significantly. And I find in a lot of my patients, just by having them eliminate that one thing, which requires a bit of effort, and eating at home, more often than not, that helps fix a lot of issues, whether it's weight loss resistance, they've got brain fog, they've got chronic pain and inflammation in a joint, which is super common for women in middle age. More often than not, removing inflammatory foods makes a huge difference. And isn't that really where things are supposed to start from, really stem from, is food?
So just by removing vegetable oils, for instance, from your diet, you'll get not 20-to-1 ratio, but for instance, 10-to-1. It's still a lot, but it's twice less.
Right. And so we're always looking for balance. So I will oftentimes say, you know, there's testing you can do to look at like what is your personal, you know, what is your personal omega-6, omega-3 profile in your body. I find those tests can stress people out quite a bit because it usually then involves some degree of supplementation. And, you know, I'm sure we will talk about supplements, and I think there is a place for them, but it really does start with food. But ideally, it would be 1-to-1, but that's not realistic. So I think even if we got 10-to-1, 5-to-1, that's a much better ratio than 20-to-1, which when I explain that to people, I think they're sometimes stunned because they just had no idea about that imbalance and how that drives inflammation. And really, again, I'll go back to the same thing. Inflammation, oxidative stress, poor metabolic health all go together. They play really well together. Once the body gets inflamed, it oftentimes stays inflamed until we make some significant life shifts. And the answer is not always medication. Medication has a place. I don't want to, as someone who has the ability to write prescriptions, I never want the message to be that traditional allopathic medicine has it wrong, but, and this is a very big but, you must start with lifestyle. You must.
But once you get all the time inflamed, you feel bad, you can't move, or you move all the time with the pain in your joints, just like you mentioned. It also affects your mood, the way you feel, not physically, but mentally. You're anxious, angry.
Well, we see, I mean, if you understand that the bulk of our neurotransmitters are produced in the gut, and when we talk about the gut, we can talk about the gut microbiome, which, you know, back in the old days when I went to college, we didn't learn much about it because it's really come about in the last 5 to 10 years that we really now understand what's going on in the gut. But it's absolutely essential that, or to our understanding of mental health, is the interrelationship with nutrition, that they come together, that there's so much research emerging in this area in particular, and helping people understand that the bulk of our neurotransmitters, in particular serotonin, which is a hormone that's designed not just to help with pleasure and mood, also impacts sleep vis-a-vis tryptophan, vis-a-vis melatonin. And so helping people understand that the foods that we choose to eat can have a profound net impact on our mental health. Anxiety is the #1 mood disorder in the United States. Number 2 to that is depression. They go together very often, and it's not just cyclical. You know, I think for a lot of individuals to say, well, women get, you know, moody around their periods. Yes, because there's a lot of hormonal changes that go on, and that can also exist in perimenopause and even menopause. But understanding at the crux of that is really this nutritional paradigm that we don't speak to enough. Most people are eating too much carbohydrate, too little protein, and the wrong types of fats. And that in and of itself can set the stage for not just poor physical health, but also poor mental health. And I think we're coming around that we're no longer shaming our patients. I mean, I certainly never did this, but I think that there was so much shame around mental health issues that many patients weren't getting the help that they needed and deserved to have. And so I think there's a lot of researchers that are now speaking so openly about this, that it's turning the dynamic of mental health on its side in a way that I think is profound and really impactful.
So prior to that, you've mentioned this omega-3s and the fish. So you are very lucky here in the U.S. because you've got Alaska and you got the wild salmon. So for instance, in EU and Europe, you only get like Norwegian salmon, which is poison, right?
Well, I mean, I think that I don't know a lot about Norwegian salmon. We ideally we want wild caught as opposed to farm raised, because farm raised fish are, unfortunately, they're very susceptible to exposure to toxins. So if they're farm raised and even the wild caught, we get concerned about what they've been exposed to in terms of toxins, because much like, you know, shellfish, fish in general, they're swimming in a toxic stew, and then we consume those things. I think a lot about, you know, Fukushima, and when Japan had that nuclear reactor that kind of imploded,
13 years ago.
Yes, and thinking about the impact on all the fisheries and all the fishing, that has had a worldwide impact, whether or not people are concerned about that or not. I mean, I certainly think about it when people talk about wanting to eat a lot of seaweed products. I'm like, well, maybe we just need to be conscientious about where things are sourced from, but understanding that our waters have really gotten polluted. So ideally you want wild caught, but the caveat being, where is it caught? And I don't know enough about Norwegian salmon to
It's
know.
basically white. It doesn't have any omega-3s because it doesn't eat
any of the plankton.
Yeah, algae.
Interesting. Yeah. It's interesting because, it's that bright. And what's interesting, some of the farm raised, they actually get dyed.
Yes.
So when you look at when you look at a wild caught salmon, it should be pink, but it shouldn't be bright pink. And that's some of the farm raised stuff that I've seen where I'm like, I think I'll pass. I think I'm not going to have that farm raised piece of salmon in the restaurant. I think I'll pick something else out.
Yeah, and they feed it with, I want to say, with oats, with soy. So this fish would never get an access to soy or oats or something like that.
And again, it goes back to it's designed to fatten it up. Grains from the oats, soy, absolutely. And just understanding, like, we get into this, this circular situation, whether it's the cattle, whether it's the fish, whether it's the chicken, whether it's the pork, what they've eaten. We eat what they eat, ultimately. And I just had an expert on, Dr. Sean O'Mara, who talks about visceral fat. So obviously the fat subcutaneous fat is the fat that annoys us. We don't like it, but it's not really detrimental. Yes. It's more of an aesthetics thing. Visceral fat is deep within our organs. So pancreas, liver, etc. And he was mentioning when we were having this conversation about the fact that when we're looking at visceral fat, helping people understand that when you look at a ribeye steak, although I know delicious for those who like fatty steak, or a piece of filet, understanding you are consuming a heavily fatted, probably purposefully so, piece of meat. You're then consuming the adipose tissue, which tends to be highly inflammatory. I'm sure I'll get some hate mail for saying that. But for individuals to understand, those fattier cuts are going to be more infiltrated with fatty tissue, adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is really not, it's a tissue. It's actually its own sophisticated organ. Adipose tissue and organs are really, really sophisticated and highly inflammatory.
What do you think of those new age diets like the Lion diet or the ones where people eat only, for instance, meat, beef, some fruit, and no grains at all, no veggies at all?
Very bio-individual. For full disclosure, I was in the hospital in 2019 for 13 days and then did 9 months of carnivore, not because I wanted to be full carnivore. It was the only thing that didn't upset my stomach. My digestive system was a wreck after 6 weeks of antibiotics and antifungals. I think for a lot of people, going carnivore for a brief period of time can be very anti-inflammatory. And by that, I mean, for some people, I think they need to do that they need to kind of do something severe for a month, 6 weeks, to dial back in, just like Whole30, no gluten, no grains, no sugar, no alcohol, et cetera, no soy. Sometimes people have to do something that's a little bit severe to get a hold of what's going on in the gut or what's going on with their health. For so many people, do I think long-term carnivore is good for everyone? Probably not. I do think, and I'm friends with a lot of the carnivore guys. In particular, seems to be a lot of men, although I know plenty of women as well. It's been able to get their autoimmune conditions reversed. They feel better. They're sleeping well. Their markers look great. Their hormones are stable. And this is where I think bio-individuality really is very important. I like meat and I like fish, and the bulk of my diet is protein, but I do like vegetables and I like fruit. And so I think for many, many people, it's figuring out like what's your poison. If you were to say to me, my kryptonite is rice, and once I start eating rice, I can't stop. Well, then maybe that's a situation where eliminating grains might be beneficial if you struggle to, moderate. I always say if you can't moderate, eliminate. That's kind of my standard phrase, which seems to go over pretty well with people. They're like, okay, I can moderate, insert whatever thing it is that they enjoy eating. And then things you can't moderate, you eliminate. But I think carnivore can be therapeutic if used strategically. Do I think most people need to do full carnivore for the rest of their lives? No. But I do find for some people, it just works for them, and they don't miss the vegetables. They don't miss, they have honey. Maybe they're having, some fruit here and there. They haven't developed a vitamin C deficiency or scurvy, so that, that concern is off the table. But I think for some people, it does work well. Do I think everyone needs to do it? No. Is it nice for a reset? Yes.
Do you think veganism is a scam?
Do I think it's a scam? Yeah.
Because I've tried it for 2 years.
Wow. I would say that's impressive. So here's what I would say from a very non-pejorative way. With veganism, it's very hard to get your protein intake where it needs to be. most of the people I speak to are individuals that are 35 and up, and protein is critically important. We need more protein with age, not less. What I like about veganism is that if you're doing it purely without all the processed food crap, you're probably eating more nutrient-dense foods. You're probably eating more vegetables. You're probably going out of your way to get some plant-based protein. And by that, I mean not the soy-based, but nuts and seeds and things like that. And I think if you're going from a standard American diet to that, that's probably not a bad thing. You'll probably feel pretty good. And then you're going to be missing things, B12 and other items from your diet. And so I think that is certainly a circumstance where I would say maybe that's a good idea to do for a couple months if you need a reset. But my concern about veganism or just being vegan is the lack of protein. And I think, and no, animal-based protein is superior in their amino acid profile. And as we get older, we need more protein, not less. So my teenagers that I was talking about, very athletic, very lean, very fit, they probably need a lot less protein to trigger muscle protein synthesis in the body to help build and maintain muscle versus my husband and I. And so that is why it's so important that as we're getting older, that we're really conscientious. Like I know I need a minimum, for me personally, 50 grams. That's what I aim for at that first meal of the day to, break my fast. And my concern about veganism, just taking
you consume 50 grams of protein
in my first meal.
With the breakfast? Mm-hmm. Wow. What do you do? Steak? Eggs?
Oftentimes, yes.
That's a lot.
But I feel good that way, and that's what works for me. But that is always my concern about veganism, is that I think oftentimes what is overeaten is a lot of processed foods, a lot of soy-based foods.
Not enough leucine.
Yeah, well, and that leucine threshold is super important. And actually, I was talking to someone else on the podcast talking about there's a certain supplement that's coming out that gives a dileucine threshold, so it stimulates more muscle protein synthesis. Having said that, that's my concern about veganism is most of the patients that I see, they're not doing even eggs. They're not doing any dairy. They're grossly under-eating protein. They get very sarcopenic, meaning muscle loss, which starts with strength loss, which is catastrophic. Yeah, which is a catastrophic process. I know because I lost most of my muscle being hospitalized for 13 days and being in a hospital bed. But helping people understand, there's certainly a way to navigate nutritional choices thoughtfully. Like I do respect the fact that when I talk to some vegans, they really have a tremendous love and reverence for animals, and I can respect that. And I never want to diminish that, but helping them understand, like we just need to round out your macros to make sure that you're setting yourself up for not overeating carbs, not undereating protein, and making sure you're not buying into the processed food game, because even a Twinkie, believe it or not, is technically vegan.
Twinkie is a cookie?
It's like a Hostess product it's like a cake, but it's not a cake. It's crap. It will probably outlive the apocalypse. It's a terrible thing. I think when I was a kid, I liked them. They probably were real food back then, but now it's just a bunch of crap.
But every time you take a vegan product and you see the ingredients list, it's like this.
Correct.
And you can't even spell it, pronounce
Correct.
it. You know,
I'm like, I'm not even sure what that is. And that's the game I used to play with my kids when we would go grocery shopping. I would say, how many ingredients are on the food label? Can you pronounce it? And I'm like, if I don't know what it is and you don't know what it is and we can't pronounce it, then we're not eating it. And so, again, veganism, that's my greatest concern. How did you feel when you were vegan for 2 years?
Terrible.
Yeah.
Just terrible. So I had this thing on my lips. I don't know how is it called? Just inflammation on the lip. And it stayed like for 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks. Then I switched to eating just fish. It was gone like
it was
in
a
2
protein
days.
deficiency.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people forget. And it's interesting. I have a family member who will remain nameless who was vegan for 5+ years, and it really messed up her hormones like so substantially that I think it's left an untoward impact on her health. And she would talk very openly about that. I'm not sharing anything that she would be uncomfortable about, but I think people start doing veganism out of a curiosity, and then they get to a point where they feel good initially because they're eating more real food, hopefully, more nutrient dense, vegetables, seeds, etc. but it gets very, very challenging to get enough protein in. And that's always my concern. I'm like, if you understand what we're up against as we get older, and maybe your listeners are aware of this, maybe they're not, there's this protein leverage hypothesis. And so if you're not getting enough protein in your diet, your body will find a way to extract calories from something else. So this is when patients will tell me, I ate a really good lunch, and then I got really busy in the afternoon and I wasn't able to get enough of my dinner in. And then the pantry was calling me at 9 o'clock at night. And it's because their body's looking for more food, and it's going to get it from something probably hyper processed. You're not craving a steak at 9 o'clock at night. It's probably chips. It's probably ice cream.
Something quick.
Right. Those, hyper processed carbs and probably some unhealthy fats. And so helping people understand, like, your body intuitively will let you know if you're in need of something. It's our responsibility to be conscientious about it.
How much protein do you think we need to consume? Like 1 gram per pound?
That's ideal. Again, I say ideal. And I think for most women, it's really daunting to think about, like, if your healthy weight for a woman is 140, 150, that's a lot of protein. That's daunting. And most women are consuming 40, 50 grams of protein total. Oh, wow. So I always say no less than 100 grams a day. So that's a starting point for anyone who's watching, listening. For me personally, I aim for 120 grams a day. That's my goal. Do I hit it every single day? No. When I travel, sometimes it's challenging. And that's why I'll take essential aminos as, essential amino acids in the interim. But I like to get all my protein from food. So I think for a lot of individuals, if they do nothing else, just track your macros. There's lots of apps that are out there. Just build awareness around how much or how little you're eating. If you're eating any less than 30 grams of protein in a meal and you're an adult, you're not hitting that leucine threshold to trigger muscle protein synthesis. And why do I keep harping on this is because the first site of insulin resistance in our body are our muscles. And we start to accelerate the loss of muscle mass after the age of 40. So maybe it happens more catastrophically and quickly in women, but men will go through that too. You think about how many, I always call them the skinny fat people. I see women sorry to pick on Pilates. I take Pilates, but I don't use that in place of strength training. But I see a lot of very thin women in Pilates, and they have a pancake butt. They've got very thin legs. And that's the aesthetic a lot of women want to achieve, but at the expense of losing muscle mass. And you can see the same thing happening in men. A lot of middle-aged men that you'll start seeing, they've lost a lot of muscle mass. They look kind of, they may still be, a healthy weight, but they've lost quite a bit of muscle mass. And then it becomes this cascade of untoward effects: insulin resistance, sarcopenia, which is this muscle loss with weight, muscle wasting that happens with age unless we're actively working against it. And one of the most important things we can do is eat enough protein and lift weights.
And low testosterone, you see the way that men look, the way that they their posture, they're like always this.
Yes. And so that you're describing kyphosis, which is this, inclination where your shoulders kind of roll forward, the neck goes down, and that can be both a muscular and a bone issue that can happen with age, and it's not per se reversible. And what I think is unfortunate, especially for men, is here in the United States, we have these catastrophic rates of low testosterone, infertility, which is related to multiple things. But the number one reason why that's happening is insulin resistance, driving down testosterone, and number two is exposure to toxins. So if we think that the discussion on toxins is just an issue for women, it's an issue for men too. It's, what are you exposed to in your environment? Personal care products and food plays a large net impact on what goes on with your hormones.
How do you feel when a nutrition specialist say that a calorie is a calorie? So all you need is 2,000 calories a day.
That's my favorite question. I always say calories are important, but it's not the whole picture. And the reason why is, I think about Dr. Robert Lustig talking about this, that it's a unit of measurement. A calorie is a unit of measurement. Do calories matter? To a point.
But a measurement of what? Of energy?
A measurement. So these bomb calorimeters, yes, that's exactly what it's measuring. So I help people understand, like, as an example, protein and carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. Fat is 9. So I bring that up just to identify it is very easy to overeat fat. So women will say to me, I'm trying to lose weight, but I'm eating like, and I'm exaggerating, 5 avocados and I had, 3 cups of nuts. And I'm like, number one, you're eating too much fat. It's more than twice the caloric value of protein or carbohydrates. But calories only tell us one part of the equation as it pertains to weight gain, weight loss. It's also hormonally mediated. And this is where, the gym bros get it wrong when they say, there's a 25-year-old gym bro. In fact, I argue with my 16-year-old about this because he'll say to me, if I want to gain weight or I want to gain muscle, these are the things I need to do. And I said, that's great. You're 16 years old. You're metabolically healthy. You have a lot of muscle. Most people, when I'm talking to them, are not 16 years old. They are more than likely older than 35. They're doing a lot of the right things. But once there's a hormonally mediated issue, whether it's low testosterone, which for a lot of people impacts body composition quite profoundly and significantly, imbalances in other sex hormones, low thyroid function, leptin and ghrelin, which are these appetite, satiety, and hormone cues. There's so many things that can drive weight loss resistance and whether or not someone can lose or gain weight easily and readily. And so once people understand that I always say it's complicated. It's not just one thing. And then you add in, again, like the toxins piece, we are just living in a toxic stew. And these endocrine disrupting chemicals, as an example, can offset the receptor for that exact hormone. Mm-hmm. And they can be 100 times more potent than the hormone. And so helping people understand the cards are stacked against us when we're trying to understand why we can become weight loss resistant, as an example. Calories are one part of the equation. They're not irrelevant, but it is not the calories in, calories out, eat more, exercise less, or eat less, exercise more, which is what I used to tell patients because that's what I was taught. And now I humbly say that was incorrect information, but that was what everyone was saying at that time. Just eat less, exercise more, that'll do it. It's not like our bodies are not a chemistry kit. They're far more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, but let's take a look. Let's take, for instance, carbohydrates, 4 calories a gram, and protein as well, right? But if I eat, for instance, 50 grams of carbs and 50 grams of protein, my body is going to react way differently.
Correct. Absolutely.
With protein, I'm going to feed my muscle.
Right. You're going to be satiated.
Yeah.
You eat 50 grams of carbohydrate by itself, you're going to get a much more exaggerated blood sugar response. Depending on 50 grams is a lot. So I would say 30 grams or less is typically what I'm recommending for most of my patients, and even less if they are
carbs or protein?
Carbs.
30 grams?
Mm-hmm. In a meal. That's about what your body can handle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a very small amount.
Well, I mean, think about it. That could be a banana. That could be half a cup of rice. I mean, so helping people understand, like, we tend to overdo it with carbohydrate at the expense of other macronutrients. And so it's helping people grow understanding, like, the bulk of our plate should really be, non-starchy vegetables, which, if you have a salad with some protein and maybe depending on what the protein is, maybe you're having avocado or some nuts on top of the salad, that's great. But having a big bowl of pasta with 2 shrimp on it is definitely going to skew in the other direction, where it's going to make you craving more food. You're not as satiated. You have a much more exaggerated blood sugar response. And we can talk around tricks that I'll recommend for people to do. But I think in many instances, people are overeating carbohydrates, not understanding the negative net impact, why they're not satiated, and they can't step away from the table and feel like they're done. And they just keep craving more and more and more food.
That's a roller coaster.
Correct. And it has a lot to do with blood sugar regulation.
Have you ever been to Italy?
I have. I was there last September.
Did you notice there are almost no obese people right there? But they eat what? Pasta, pizza,
but the portions are
raviolis?
small. The portions are small. I mean, I'm 25% Italian. The way that Italians eat and the way that I was raised, organ meats, we had salad with every meal.
Yes.
We had a lot of meat. And when I say a lot of meat, organ meats, veal, I mean, we had everything, not necessarily the things I loved eating, but we were given. And pasta was a small portion. My mom didn't cook a lot of starchy stuff, and everything was homemade. She was crunchy before people even knew what that was. She made our bread and wanted us to have whole grains, but we ate very small portions of carbohydrates. It was always protein, vegetables. There was always a salad, which drove us crazy growing up. But and I'd milk at every meal, which still cracks me up that my mom thought that was very healthy. Having said that, I think that when you go outside the United States, you realize here the portion distortion is unbelievable. Oftentimes it's 3 to 4 times the portion that you should be eating, versus you go to Europe as an example, and the portions are much smaller, and you walk away from the table and you're not overstuffed. You don't feel like you need to take a nap. I had a wonderful meal in Venice for our 20th anniversary. And I remember saying to my husband, it was like the perfect amount of food in each course. Like you wanted more. You were like, oh, that was delicious. But I had just enough to have the whole experience, but not be stuffed.
Golden ratio.
It was perfect. And so I wish that was the case here. But more often than not, when you go to restaurants, it's way more food than anyone could eat.
And the thing that you call pizza, that's not a pizza. Pizza in Italy is real pizza. Right here is like, what is that? That's a pancake? What is that?
Have you had New York pizza?
Never.
New York pizza is pretty amazing. I grew up in New Jersey, and so, we know what real pizza should look like and what the crust should be like and the cheese to air ratio and all of that. Yes. I mean, it's kind of a monstrosity. You think about, if you've ever seen Chicago style pizza, which is like eating a box of bread, on top of it a bunch of cheese and sauce. And, Chicago is like one of these big foodie cities. They've got amazing food. But I always think about that kind of pizza like that is an abomination as an Italian.
What do you think of milk and raw milk specifically?
I think if you tolerate dairy, I think that, whole milk dairy, raw milk dairy, which can be super controversial, really shouldn't be. Back when I still ate dairy, I loved raw milk cheese. There was this amazing distributor on the East Coast that had this delicious cheddar. Unfortunately, I don't tolerate dairy much anymore. Having said that, I think that it can be part of a healthy diet, but I think it should be the fermented options, whether it's full-fat organic Greek yogurt, whether it's kefir, really looking for the highest quality that you can find. And depending on what state you live in the United States, you may not even be able to talk about, let alone get access to raw milk. Like I live in Virginia, and I know that I've never been a raw milk person. I'm not much of a milk person, never was, except for when I was growing up and my mother forced me to drink it because that's what Italian mothers do. My kids always had like full fat milk and they liked that. Having said that, I know that the friends of mine that did consume raw milk or they gave it to their children, it was this very kind of clandestine, behind the scenes experience, because a lot of these farmers can get prosecuted.
That's crazy.
Right. And so understanding what happens with the sterilization of milk, how it destroys a lot of the beneficial properties, I think it's unfortunate. It's like many things in the United States that sometimes the lobbyists for these big, whether it's the Dairy Farmers Association, I don't know who drove the fear-mongering around raw milk, but I do know that understanding what happens with heat pasteurization, I understand back in the times of Louis Pasteur, there was no refrigeration. So they had to find ways to make things safe for people to eat. We're not in that stage anymore. And so I think sometimes we get overtly excited, paranoid, et cetera. Like my dogs eat raw meat, and we get it from a responsible place and it comes, responsibly. But I remember the first time I told the vet what my dogs ate, and my vet said, well, aren't you worried about getting salmonella? And I said, my dogs are so healthy. Like they're so lean and healthy. And even though I have 2 senior dogs, they exercise more than a lot of puppies do.
But they're supposed to eat raw meat. It's a dog.
And they love it. They love it. I told my husband this was like the greatest decision ever. Other than the fact we don't like having to, portion it out, but I'm like, we do what's best for them. So I think on a lot of different levels, sometimes we get overtly, it's like we want to live in this very sanitized environment and much like people over sanitizing their hands during the pandemic and just feeling fearful about germs. If you look at the research,
wearing the gloves,
right?
It was terrible.
Still, I can't tell you how many people on the plane still were wearing masks. Maybe they had been sick, and maybe there's a reason for that. I don't want to pass judgment, but if you look at the research, the kids that are the healthiest are the ones that are playing in the dirt, probably eating the dirt, and the kids that have animals because they're exposed to different microbes, and that helps our, gut microbiome. And so I think that we sometimes get caught up in minutia instead of being open-minded.
So we used to have a dog in Lithuania. It was Jack Russell's Terrier. And I woke up to this thing. I was feeding the dog with this dog food, and it's mostly made of grains. I was like, wait a minute, a dog eating a grain?
They're not supposed to.
They're not supposed to eat that. When you give him a bone, he goes like crazy. He likes the bone. Like, why? Because it's natural to him.
Remember what I said? Why do these industries... So it's interesting. There's food grade food for humans, and then there's everything else. And the dog kibble in the United States is made from the stuff that we wouldn't give humans. So it's the connective tissue, it's the nose. I mean, it's every part of the animal that we ourselves wouldn't eat. And so I actually had a vet on, and she was explaining it's disgusting, the process of how kibble comes about. And she said, if you understand what you're feeding your pet, you'll never want to feed that to them again. And so kibbles, it's not the right ratio of protein to carbohydrate. That's number one. Number two, as you appropriately stated, animals should, especially domesticated animals, a dog in particular, should not be eating grains. And I see a lot of backlash between my traditional allopathic trained vet friends and then the functional integrative vet friends that talk about things. And it goes back to this fear-based methodology of, there was one study where golden retrievers that were given grains developed a cardiomyopathy, which is a weakening of the heart muscle. And so then they extrapolated that no one should have, no dog should be without grains. And so that's where a lot of the rhetoric comes from. And I say all the time, I look at how healthy my pets are on these, nutrient-dense diets that are full of organ meats. And it's like a salmon, beef. I mean, it stinks. It's like salmon, beef, and I forget the other third protein. We tend to rotate them. My husband and I laugh at how the dogs eat it instantaneously, and they're anxious to get more.
Let's get back to milk. So from a philosophical stand of view, do you think human beings are supposed to drink cow's milk, which is supposed to be for
baby cows?
Baby cows? And why only cows? Maybe some goat milk, that's it? Not
there's a couple things. There's a couple things that have come up in discussions over the years. Number one, in most cultures, after the age of 2, children are not consuming milk. It's less common. We know that there's certain types of cow's milk that is harder to digest. So there are people who are lactose intolerant. I always remind people that we know that sheep and goat's milk proteins are smaller, more easily digestible. There's a variation of cow's milk called A2 milk, which is, again, more easily digestible, and some people will seek that out. Do I think that most people do well with dairy? No. Do I think that many people live a lifetime with digestive issues that they don't attribute to dairy? Yes. But dairy is so ingrained in our culture that I think that has been the hardest thing when I encourage patients to give something up, even more so than gluten. And a lot of it has to do with what goes on in the brain when we consume dairy. It lights up these kind of casomorphine receptors, these opiate receptors in the brain. A lot of people are addicted to dairy.
That's crazy to acknowledge.
Yes.
Addicted to dairy.
Addicted to dairy. And so we know, based on research, we can look at the brains of individuals that are consuming dairy products, and we can see it's a pleasure center. It makes sense. Intellectually, it makes sense. Do I think everyone needs to be consuming dairy? No. I think a lot of people just grew up eating a lot of cheese crackers. Remember, it's subsidized by the federal government. That's why we see so much cheese in the processed food industry. I think it's very bio-individual. I personally don't drink milk, and probably haven't since I left for college because it just was never my thing. But if my kids were given the opportunity, they would absolutely drink it.
Oh, really?
They love cheese. They love ice cream. That's like their treat in life is ice cream, like really good quality ice cream.
Yeah, but they like it not because of milk, because of sugar and the additives.
That is like their thing. So my kids don't eat a lot of junk, but that is like their thing. And so I'm like, they're super fit, healthy. If they want to have some ice cream once in a while, it's not a big deal. But that is like, if I were to give them options, always drawn to the ice cream.
So cow gives a birth to baby cows. And then she has milk. the milk is specifically designed for that baby cow, just like humans do, right?
Yep.
But you take that milk and you drink it. It makes no sense to me.
But what's interesting is it's that milk that's designed for that calf is different than what is put into the milk supply here in the United States, because these cows are given powerful hormones to hyper create more milk, more than they ever would on their own. They're given antibiotics. They, just think about it. If they get mastitis, so anyone that's listening, if you've ever breastfed and you get mastitis, very painful. That cow gets antibiotics, and they're supposed to dump that milk so that you're not exposed to the antibiotics, but I'm sure that doesn't always happen. And so I think that we're forcing animals that would not otherwise create those quantities of milk just to satisfy the desires of individuals in here in the United States in particular. And I don't know. I think that there's some ethical things that go on probably with that as well.
But the cow has milk only when it gives birth to a baby cow, right?
Well, correct. Unless they're dairy cows, like they're designed to, like, yes, there are cows that will birth a cow and they'll produce milk, but dairy cows are not the same cows as cows that get slaughtered for meat. And so the dairy cows, like that is like their job to produce dairy, but they give them hormones and stimulants to produce more milk. So it's not like that's what their bodies would be doing naturally.
Yes.
That volume, it is unnatural.
It's kind of a torture to an animal.
I'm sure. I mean, having breastfed 2 kids in my life, I can tell you it is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So imagine like they have multiple udders and they're given these drugs that are going to make them produce more milk than what they would normally. And that's what you're left with.
How do you view, for instance, whey protein? It's derived from milk.
Correct. I mean, I can tell you that on occasion I can tolerate whey protein. We know that whey protein can be a very good source of protein. And I'm a realist. I understand people travel, they're on the go, they need something that's quick. And we know that whey protein in many instances can be a really good source of amino acid composition. I would say that ideally we want to get most of our food from real food, but if you need to have a protein powder, I think that's absolutely fine. I think that you would want to find one that has the shortest list of ingredients with no artificial sweeteners, with junk that you cannot pronounce. And there are certainly companies that produce whey protein from grass-fed New Zealand cows or high-quality cows, grass-fed, without all the junkified ingredients, but it requires a bit of searching. But I'm a realist. I would be lying if I said to you I didn't believe in the value of some high quality. And again, stressing high quality, not like pea protein, broccoli blend, some of the things that I've seen that kind of make me scratch my head and I wonder where it's derived from.
So I want to say 10 years ago, there was this thing with whey protein, then the new product, the beef protein. And I was like, how do they make it? Beef protein? And it wasn't that expensive as a whey protein. So wait a minute. It has to be like 10 times more expensive. And how do you make the beef protein? It tastes like, I don't know.
Well, a lot of times they add stevia. And I think that it's, picking your poison. Like if someone were to say to me, I eat a nutrient-dense diet and twice a week I have whey, or 5 times a week I have whey to hit my protein needs, I'm like, that's not a big deal. But if you're eating McDonald's every day and you want to have protein and you want to have whey protein, I would say I'd rather that you have a piece of chicken, or I'd rather you have a piece of fish, or a piece of, I don't know, steak or ground meat. I at least get, or hard-boiled eggs, or an omelet. Something where you're at least getting some real protein in your body.
Let's talk about sweeteners, since we're talking about the supplements. So supplement industry is filled with sweeteners. So prior to that, we had aspartame, right? E951, I want to say. Then we had ASK. Those are horrible, we know that. Then we have sucralose. It's good, but it's not that good as we know right now. Now we have stevia. What are your thoughts on all the sweeteners?
There was a research study that was done in Nature looking at the impact of sucralose, aspartame, stevia, and saccharin, and I laughed and said, was it like the 1970s? The last time I think I heard anyone have saccharin in anything was my grandmother's Tab soda. And so this was looking specifically just at oral glucose tolerance. So consuming these products and then seeing the net impact on insulin sensitivity, and then also looking at the role of the gut microbiome. And obviously, sucralose and aspartame were terrible. Like, both impacted insulin sensitivity in a negative way, both adversely impacted the gut microbiome. Stevia was not, and saccharin gets lumped in there as well. I think stevia, if used judiciously, and when I say judiciously, meaning you're not addicted to stevia and you're using it all day long, 24/7, I find that most of my patients do better with stevia than they do with some of the other sugar alcohols, like things like allulose or erythritol.
Xylitol.
Yeah. Monk fruit appears to be well tolerated. I think stevia, if you like, I have liquid drops. So if I don't eat dairy yogurt, but if I have coconut milk yogurt or something like that and it's plain and I want to sweeten it, I don't have any problems with that. But, there's the processed food industry that has Truvia. So it's the granulated form of stevia, which has been, again, highly processed, is different than having a stevia plant or an aliquot, like a container of liquid stevia that's just alcohol that's been processed, maybe has 2 ingredients in it. I think that we as a nation have a sugar handling problem combined with a sugar addiction problem. And so all of these new sweeteners come out. Not only are they thousands, the amplification of sweetness is, I forget the statistics. It amplifies the sweetness factor. So there's something called the cephalic phase insulin response in our body. So let's say you're drinking Diet Coke after Diet Coke after Diet Coke, and we understand not only does our body think something sweet is coming and it's secreting insulin, we also know there's a large net impact on the gut microbiome. And the more I understand about the gut microbiome, we should all be doing things to support it, not degrade it. And so I think that's where my concern comes out is we want to focus in on like 1 or 2 sweeteners, but we really need to focus in on is we have a sugar addiction, a serious sugar addiction here in the United States.
So you would prefer a teaspoon of sugar or sucralose?
No. I would
if you only had two options.
Oh, neither really. I would say stevia, just because I know it has a more negligible impact on blood glucose. I would rather have something that is more natural than something that's contrived in a lab. So to answer your question, I would rather someone have a teaspoon of sucrose than aspartame or sucralose, which are the artificial sweeteners,
Yes.
the non-nutritives. Now, I would make the argument that all of us consume way too much sugar. Like way, way, way too much. Every condiment, every salad dressing, it's sneaky, it's insidious, and we don't even realize it.
So the problem with sweeteners is what? We eat something that is filled with a sweetener, for instance, sucralose, right? Our brain understands that that's sweet, and our body produces insulin to lower the sugar in the blood. But there is no sugar in the blood because there is no sugar.
But it impacts the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome is it's the last 5-10 years of research that has really started to emerge, and understanding that the gut microbiome affects everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. And so nurturing the foods, like the prebiotics, the postbiotics, the fermented foods, so important. And yet,
like sauerkraut?
Yes, like fermented vegetables, yes. Kimchi, fermented tea like kombucha or miso. This is one of the examples I will give. Like, I'm not pro-soy, but fermented soy like miso like as a dressing, miso that sometimes people use it as a broth that they'll consume before bed, all very beneficial. But I think that the issue is, number one, there's a sugar addiction in this country. So people are always looking for the next great thing that's not going to impact their blood glucose, but understanding that cephalic phase insulin response, which is a real response in the body. If you consume something sweet, your body is primed for food. That's number one. Number two, we know that it has a profound detrimental impact on the gut microbiome. And understanding that we should all be doing the things to protect the gut microbiome. It always starts with nutrition, but we know that sugar in and of itself, not only does it impact the gut microbiome, we were just talking about mental health issues and how sugar drives anxiety. There's research to suggest so. So again, when people go back to a less processed diet, they will see improvements kind of categorically in many different areas.
So we've noticed, me and my wife noticed this thing, I want to say, a year ago. after some kind of meals, we feel terrible, not physically, but like mentally. Our mood went down. Like, why? And then it clicked. Like, what did we have? We had this. No way. We had a protein bar. No way.
Yeah. No, and so think about it that way. We don't say to people, like even talking to my kids, helping them understand, like even when they were younger, I could tell when one of my children had been exposed, like go to a birthday party, which you can control everything that goes on to a point, and then they go to a birthday party and all bets are off. And so my younger son, anytime he went to a birthday party and consumed red dye number 40. Now, when I first said this to my husband thought I was nuts. And I said, take him to the movies. Let him have the high C punch. I mean, I never let my kids have soda, but I was like, just, you don't believe me, go try it. He was like, all of a sudden, our well-behaved kid couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, was all over the place, was hyperactive. And so for him, every time we went to a party, we'd have to say he cannot have any red dye. Because when he consumes red dye, and he would say to me, Mommy, I can't control my body. And it was simply a red dye in frosting, in icing, in like Skittles, packed of Skittles, in a lot of these foods that we think are so benign and innocuous. And if it's happening to our kids, it's happening to us as adults. We just may not be putting A and B together. I know for myself that the way that I eat, if I'm sleepy after a meal, something's wrong. I mean, something is absolutely wrong because I eat protein and vegetables, and that's kind of my mainstay.
It's supposed to give us an energy, not take us away.
Correct. So that's always the clue. I'm like, and sometimes I'll call the restaurant and I'll ask, can you tell me how this was prepared? And they'll say, well, next time you should tell us you have an XYZ allergy. I don't have an allergy. I definitely am sensitive to certain foods. But now I just tell people, I'm like, could you cook my steak by itself or in butter? And I find most restaurants,
they do that.
They will do that. They will do that. I was actually at an event with a colleague of mine who's very anti-seed oils at another level than I am. Like I try to go out and enjoy myself, and he has a little card that says he has an allergy to seed oils, which I think is brilliant because people take it seriously. And we were at this event. We all had bison steak. His plate goes down. All of our plates go down. His looks completely different. And I leaned over and said to him, that was brilliant. Your steak looks plated completely differently than the rest of ours.
It just looked differently? Like
it was he had a steak that was cooked in butter, and he had raw vegetables next to his. Ours was, there was some type of sauce, like it was a demi-glaze, some type of sauce on top of mine with cooked vegetables. And I was like, oh, everything's been cooked in seed oils, including that sauce. And so I was like, that was brilliant.
So we've got red 40, yellow 6, blue 5.
There's quite a few. But red dye number 40 in particular seems to be based on the research, drives hyperactivity and ADHD symptoms in kids. Like I had a young boy on my street when my boys were younger, and he had the typical, like this is what people think of when they don't have little boys and they assume this is how all little boys behave. He just had ants in his pants. He couldn't sit still. He got in a little bit of like behavioral trouble in school, but was a good kid. And this little boy was telling me, I said, tell me what did you eat for lunch today at school? And he was telling me, and I thought, this is one of those opportunities to talk to his parents in a very non-judgmental, pejorative way, because that's not my personality. It's like, really, I just want to help educate you. And this kid, when he started going to school with less processed food, totally different personality. He could sit in class, he could pay attention. I understand the convenience factor. Parents are busy, they're on the go. And things are better now than they were, when my kids were little. I made a lot of stuff. Like I was the parent that made everything, like every snack, every treat they ever had, all their birthday stuff. I made all of it because I could then control what was in it. Now there's a lot more options for parents, but I understand as a working parent how challenging it is to try to make all those things come together. But before we dive for medication, maybe it's something as simple as changing our kids' diets.
Yeah, but kids are just like rat labs. For instance, they eat all that crappy stuff. Then they go to school. A teacher notices that he is like very active. Then they say, maybe you have to visit a doctor. Doctor tells you he has ADHD. Then you got the pills. And then you suppress all that energy. So in the meantime, you feed it with the crap that causes this ADHD, and at the same time, you feed it with the pills that suppresses the ADHD.
Yeah. I mean, what I think is most unfortunate, and as the mom of all boys, and you have a son, boys are designed to move their bodies. It's the role of testosterone impacting their brain chemistry. And so I think about how many kids are not able to go about in a natural state, and yet it's something that could be so easily impacted by changing their diet. But I get it. It's harder to do that. It is so much harder to do that. But I also think when we look at the rates of ADHD, anxiety, depression, and especially coming out of the pandemic, I mean, every psychologist and psychiatrist I've spoken to on the podcast in the last couple of years, I've asked them, how has your practice changed since the pandemic? And it's almost universally, like they're starting to see trends that they'll share, or things that are more impactful that they've noticed have been helpful. And almost all of them say the same thing. Nutrition drives most mood disorders. There's a component. It may not be all of it. There could be other things at play. But I think this is a low-lying fruit that so many of us, just by simply adjusting, and it may not have to be everything. Maybe you're just giving your kid a different breakfast. Like instead of giving them a Pop-Tart, which I know, that's a highly coveted item, Crustables, instead of giving them something like that, like maybe give them leftovers or find a fun thing that they like to eat in the morning. Like my kids actually, this is funny, my kids will sit down and eat like 2 cups of rice and a pound of meat in the morning. Like they literally, that is what they will eat for breakfast. I know that's probably not realistic for younger kids, but there's so many healthier options like eggs, bacon, sausage. You could use leftovers. My kids like to, put together sometimes they would do whey protein with, protein powder. I have teenagers. Sometimes you have to meet them where they are. But with younger kids, I think there's a lot of different things that you can do. We would make healthy pancakes. We would make healthy waffles. I mean, there were lots of different things that we could do when they wanted something like that. And then I would say, that's fine, but you have to have some protein with that. You have to. You
can make pancakes at home in 15 minutes. Like it's not that long.
I could take an egg, a banana, and some whey protein powder together, and I could make a pancake. Yeah. And they didn't know any better. And I was like, they're not eating a bunch of junk. I mean, that's essentially, it's like a well-balanced carb-protein ratio, and they're happy.
But it's a non-stop cycle. For instance, you eat bad food, then you have a depression, then you go to a doctor, so you're prescribed once again with the pills. You won't get all of the pills in your lifetime. Your doctor never tells you, like, you're going to take this antidepressants for, let's say, 2 months, and you're good. Like, no. You're taking those pills.
Lifelong. Yeah. Well, my father just passed away, and we were going through my dad's stuff, and my dad was taking antidepressants and had been for a long time. And my brother and I were having this conversation, and I said, I think if Dad had changed his diet, I think if Dad had been willing to change his diet, which you get to a point where a lot of people are like, this works for me and I'm not changing. That's kind of where my dad was. And I said, but it made me so sad because I think his quality of life. So we were talking about kids. We can also talk about older adults. I think my dad's quality of life could have been so much better if he had changed his diet. And so I think that it runs the gamut, but a lot of it's being open-minded. And I would say to my dad, I really think you need to talk to your internist about this and this and this. And he would say, okay. And then I know he didn't do it.
How old was he?
My dad just passed away. He was 81. So he lived a very long life.
So he could have like additional 5 years with his grandsons. And your kids would have 5 additional more years with his granddad.
Yep. I just did an AMA, an Ask Me Anything, devoted to my dad, because my purpose of doing that podcast was to say my dad didn't need to die. And I don't say that to be trite, but my dad developed the sequelae that so many Americans do. They lose muscle, they become frail, they fall, they hit their head. They hit their head often enough, they develop a bleed, and they die. And that's exactly what happened to my dad. And so I remember one of my colleagues said, what are you going to do differently? This was after it happened. Mm-hmm. And I said, I've always been someone that exercised. I said, honest to God, the next day I called the personal trainer I'd been talking to, and said, I need to up my game, because I think about my boys and I'm like, I do not want my kids to have to bury me at 81 of something that was totally preventable. And that's what's sad. That's what's sad. So, for anyone that's listening, all of us have parents that are getting older. And I say to my mom all the time, and my parents have been divorced for a long time, I'm like, you're starting to look really frail. I'm like, what can we do? Can I help get you a personal trainer? Can I encourage you to go to a yoga class or Pilates or whatever? Like, my stepfather's retired military, so he's like super fit, and I'm just watching that happen. And I see that not just as a clinician, but also as a daughter. Mm-hmm. And you realize most people walking around assume that frailty is normal. They assume that this is everyone's destiny. And they just get to a point where you don't do much. And you're just waiting to die, which is what my father jokingly used to say to me. This is what happens after a certain age. You're just waiting to die. I said, Dad, that's kind of morbid. Very morbid. Again, the depression. But the point of why I shared that is, we can talk about how it impacts the younger generation, also impacts the older generation. Obviously, that generation, very proud. Mental health issues were things they didn't want to talk about. There was a lot of shame, a lot of secrecy. And yet we need to have those conversations, because so much of what we see is preventable.
Yeah, but your dad was 80 years old. So when he was a kid, or when he was a youngster, like 20 years old, he didn't have that kind of food that we have right now.
No. My dad was very, this is funny. When I went off to college, my parents both separately said to me, they were like, most parents say, don't get pregnant, don't do drugs. My parents, don't go off to college and gain the freshman 15, which I'm sure you probably have heard that expression. People go off to college to gain a bunch of weight because they can unfettered access to whatever they want 24/7. That was my father's greatest concern. Not don't do drugs, don't get pregnant, don't do something stupid. It was don't gain the freshman 15. I remember thinking, like, what a strange message to hear from your parent. That's where his mindset was, somehow you looking healthy is a reflection of me.
Yeah, but if you get pregnant in college, you're going to gain like 30 pounds.
Right.
But Can you reverse osteoporosis?
Can you reverse osteoporosis? So when we talk about bone loss, there are things we can definitely do. We know that strength training, weighted vest training, certainly eating adequate amounts of protein. There are drugs that are designed, now I'm going to say in air quotes, designed to help with osteoporosis, but they don't build healthy bone. That's the concern. There's actually some side effects from biphosphonates that include bisphonates. They include things like osteomalacia, which means you can actually develop weakening of your mandible, of your bone in your jaw, which is a bad thing. What I like to do and what I like to talk about is hormone replacement therapy, because what starts to happen is women are navigating perimenopause and menopause. The loss of estrogen will trigger this imbalance between progesterone and estrogen. One builds bone, one breaks bone down. Yes. And so that gets accelerated in menopause in this low estrogen state. And so we know that there's multiple things. We have testosterone receptors even on our bones. So I help people understand it's rebalancing these hormones, usually with hormone replacement therapy. I'm on both estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone. Not every woman needs testosterone, but most of us do. But helping people understand that is absolutely part of it. But strength training is primary, and then also that nutrition piece. Not drinking alcohol or limiting your alcohol intake is also important. There's a lot of things that people do that they unknowingly will accelerate bone loss. Chronically under eating, anorexia, a lot of people that have latent eating disorders. And there's a lot of women that just grossly, and you live in the world of Hollywood, where you see a lot of people who are just, they chronically undernourish their bodies, and that can be problematic as well.
So the earlier you start just lifting weights, the better that is.
Absolutely.
You get 20 years of experience by lifting weights, starting like, for instance, at 15 or 20, you're going to be good at 50.
Yes. And we know we build peak bone and muscle mass in our 20s and 30s. So as an example, here in the United States, there's a lot of use of oral contraceptives. I get it, so women have control over when they choose to have children, but you're lowering your estrogen levels to a nearly menopausal state in a time in your life when you should be building peak bone and muscle mass. So we're starting to see a lot of women that are younger that are osteopenic, which is not technically a diagnosis, but it's comparing old bone to young bone and where you fall in between. But we're starting to see a lot of women from my generation that were on the pill for many years, appropriately so, to control when they chose to have children and for birth control, who are, unknowingly, they have like minimized their ability to build bone and muscle mass at a time in their life when they need to. And I can honestly tell you that no one ever counseled me on that, not one person. And I'm a licensed healthcare provider. Not one person ever had that conversation with me.
So basically women at their 20s physically are like in their 40s and 50s.
Well, we hope not. So there's something called premature ovarian failure, which we're starting to see more of. It's catastrophic in a young woman. Because it's one thing if you get to 45, 50, 55 and you go into menopause. Like you're not, you've lived 2/3 of your life. You've got another third to live, but it's not the bulk of your life. If you're 25 and you're not getting a menstrual cycle, that is catastrophic. Because you having to navigate 2/3 of your lifetime without those hormones, those women need hormones. They absolutely need hormones. Our menstrual cycle is as important as any other vital sign. I don't see enough people talking about that. It is imperative. So if you're not getting a menstrual cycle in your 20s or 30s, that is cause for concern and requires immediate evaluation. Sometimes it takes women an entire year to get properly diagnosed with premature ovarian failure.
So if you don't have a menstrual cycle, there are some causes, like for instance, stress, right? Eliminating fats and using those pills.
Yeah. I mean, it can be nutrition. It can be stress mediated. It can be over exercising. It can be latent anorexia. I see a lot of individuals that hide their eating disorder in the guise of intermittent fasting, when in essence, no, I'm completely serious. And that's why I feel like I have a tremendous responsibility as a female to make sure I'm saying that. Like I've started calling people out on it because I don't ever want to justify someone not eating as a means of living. Like that's a problem.
So you go to a restaurant with your friends and they're not eating because they're intermittent fasting?
Well, that's different. That's different. Like there are people who will hide their anorexia. They'll say, I intermittent fast, but they just don't eat. So there's an important distinction. I think most women who are intermittent fasting are legitimately doing it, but I think there's just as many, well, maybe there's a small minority of individuals that really aren't intermittent fasting. They're just hiding their latent eating disorder.
Why it's so good for a human body to intermittent fasting?
Oh, because we eat too damn often. So our bodies are designed to have periods of time throughout the day where we're not eating. And so if we look back at, all the major religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, etc., there's some degree of fasting practices that are part of religion. So it's not a new or novel concept, but why is it good for our bodies? Because our bodies aren't designed to eat all day long. They're not designed to be processing food all the time. It's an efficiency piece, but it's also understanding physiologically what goes on behind the scenes when we're not eating. We get a reduction in inflammation. We get upregulation if we fast long enough in something called autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process in the body. We get an improvement in biophysical markers. So when my patients start fasting, they get improvements in glucose, insulin sensitivity. More often than not, if they're changing their diet, they're also getting improvements in their triglycerides, their HDL, other types of biophysical markers, high sensitivity, CRP, et cetera. They get digestive rest. This is something that most people don't even realize. Like when we're eating food constantly, there's something called the migrating motor complex in the gut. And it's like a janitor, but the janitor can't work efficiently if it's dealing with a bolus of food every 2 hours. The janitor works best when we go 4 to 5 hours between meals. And so just helping people understand, I'm not saying don't eat, I'm just saying don't eat so frequently. And the bare minimum for everyone, and this includes my teenagers, which it's amazing they can do this because they eat so much. 12 hours without eating is not something.
It's very easy.
Correct. That's the bare minimum for everyone. That is safe for young women to do, young men, people who have stopped growing. Let me specify. I always get the question, do you recommend fasting for your kids? I was like, absolutely not. But 12 hours of digestive rest for the grandparents works well. It works well for adults. It works well for young adults. I think that we have been conditioned that we can't go without food in this country. You know, you go to any sporting event, you go to the movies, you get on an airplane, you go to an airport, there's junk and crap everywhere all the time.
So my kid is 5, so he goes to sleep, I want to say at 8 p.m. He wakes up at 7, but we have breakfast at 9 only, so he has 13 hours fast.
And he's probably totally fine. And
He's totally
your son,
fine.
when I met him, looks very healthy. And like, if you were to meet
He doesn't crave any food.
Yeah. I mean, my
Time.
6 foot tall, lean, healthy, athletic teenagers, they're super healthy, and they eat voluminous amounts of food when they eat.
Yes. So would you recommend 16 to 8, 10 to 14?
I think it depends on
For
the
a grown-up.
individual. I think when we're setting up like goals and expectations, I think doing a 16-8 is something to work towards. So 16 hours fasted with an 8-hour feeding window. Here's the caveat. You need to be able to get in enough protein in your feeding window. This is where the OMAD people come out of the woodwork and get really angry with me. If you are to consume no less than 100 grams of protein a day, figure out the math. Can you eat 100 grams? And I guess there are some men that can, and if they can, that's great. I haven't met any women that can get 100 grams of protein in a meal and be able to function. I can probably get to 60 grams, and then I'm pretty full for me personally. So I think that, you know, when we're talking about those windows, it's really how much time do you need to be able to get in enough protein? And that's your answer.
So I've tried. Right now I'm doing like I want to say 12 hours fasting. That's minimum. But a few years prior to that, I've been doing intermittent fasting. I wouldn't say for a year, 16 to 8. So what I noticed is I was eating from 10 to 6. So every day I woke up at 7, and for 3 hours I was thinking what I'm gonna have for breakfast, and I prepared my food.
I love it.
I was like, I have like 30 minutes to prepare, so maybe some waffles, some pancakes, some eggs or something like that. And I would do that, the breakfast, and I was like, 10 a.m., cool. And I enjoyed the meal more. And the same thing was the last meal.
Yep.
I was like, what do I want to have for my last meal at 6 p.m.? Let me think about it.
Thoughtful and intentional.
Yes, it was intentional. Like, that's my last meal. It has to be like a bit bigger because I'm going to fast for 16 hours then. Let's get back to women's health. So periods. What would you recommend for women to eat during the periods? Because it can enhance the mood, or it can do the vice versa for them.
Yeah. So if we look at a 28-day cycle, and so our follicular phase is really day 1 up until ovulation. The follicular phase is when estrogen predominates, and this is our superpower. So women can get away with more intense exercise. If they want to do a little bit of intermittent fasting, or they want to, have a lower carbohydrate diet, they can get away, or ketogenic even. They do best in that time frame. When we're talking about after ovulation during the luteal phase, this is when progesterone predominates. This is when most women don't have as much energy. They might be craving more carbohydrate. That has a lot to do with what's going on physiologically behind the scenes, and whether or not their body's preparing for a pregnancy or they're getting ready to have a menstrual cycle. This is when women may want more discretionary carbohydrate. And I always say get it from high quality sources like root vegetables, sweet potato, low glycemic berries, like get it from that as opposed to like the processed carbs, like more bread, more pasta, more rice, which is probably going to drive more cravings, more blood sugar dysregulation. This is the time to do like gentle yoga, maybe some Tai Chi, maybe less intense physical activity, and maybe you need to do a little bit more rest. The other thing is when we talk about intermittent fasting, this is when I'll say to women, don't do more than 12 to 13 hours a day of digestive rest. And I emphasize digestive rest so that they don't think that 13 hours is really fasting. It really isn't. It's really just giving your body a little bit of time. And then, some women, when they start bleeding, they crave more iron-rich foods. They might be looking for beef, spinach, etc. I encourage people to keep a log of what they're craving during their cycle, because more often than not, that can be a reflection of things that they intrinsically are lacking in their diet that they may benefit from. And so there's some degree of bioindividuality, but it's understanding what's going on physiologically that will oftentimes drive activity, sleep needs, nutritional needs, etc.
So women should eat more or less during the periods? If they want to.
Well,
if they're craving for something, for instance, sweet.
I usually say, think about the quality of the carbohydrates you're consuming. So I'd rather someone have some high quality dark chocolate, maybe a piece of fruit, as opposed to eating like a candy bar or a bunch of ice cream. Because what I find is once they start on that blood sugar dysregulation piece, it just exacerbates things. It just gets worse and worse.
What about what to avoid at that time? Maybe some specific food that the woman should avoid, definitely?
Not so much. I mean, I think it goes back to like the quality of food is still important. I find a lot of women are craving those like iron-rich foods, and they'll say like, gosh, why am I craving steak? Why am I craving spinach? Why am I craving these foods that have a lot of iron? And it's related to the blood loss. So it's really this kind of intrinsic intuition. Nothing per se that I would say I don't think you should be consuming. There's certainly no research that I've read that said like such and such would be bad, but the better you are eating nutritionally, the better, the more likely you are to have less symptoms. So when people talk about premenstrual syndrome or even PMDD, those symptoms can get magnified if you are eating a highly processed, hyperpalatable diet. So again, we go back to the gut microbiome, we go back to serotonin production, we go back to the bulk of our neurotransmitters. All those things can be impacted. The other thing that I would say is, depending on the age of the woman, less circulating progesterone around when you start bleeding. For some women, it may show up as insomnia. It may show up as anxiety and depression. So being aware of that and getting support if you need it. There are foods that technically support progesterone production, but I find for most of my women, they actually benefit from progesterone supplementation for the week prior to their menstrual cycle. It can be life-changing for a lot of women.
And if you feel bad, if you have a bad mood, if you feel anxious during the period, and then you take the bad food,
it just amplifies it.
It amplifies it.
Yes, absolutely.
And you don't realize it. Why? Then you think you need more sweets, more chocolate bars.
Potentially. And I acknowledge
that's
that.
That's a vicious cycle.
Right. And I acknowledge, like, when even just going through my father's death, it was super stressful. There was a lot going on. And I said to my brother, I was like, I don't normally make even gluten-free brownies. I just don't, because it's like my kryptonite. And I was like, I had 2 or 3 nights over the course of a month where I made myself a small amount of this and just enjoyed it. And I said, I knew it was boosting my serotonin temporarily. But acknowledging that, like being aware of it, not being orthorexic. If I crave something, I'm like, okay, understanding like, why is my body craving this? And saying, okay, there are times when I think it's okay to eat X, Y, or Z. But making sure you keep your, don't keep your kryptonite at your house. Make sure if you're going to make something, it's something small. And then like I'll pass things. I give my neighbors stuff all the time. I'm like, please enjoy these.
And you have to make an effort to get that food.
Correct.
So speaking of gluten, so I don't know why, but the US, I want to say the UK, the whole Europe is not big on one thing that Lithuanians and Russian speakers eat a lot, which is buckwheat.
Yes.
So buckwheat does not have any gluten, right?
It is, despite the name, it is not wheat. Yes.
Yes.
So there's a variation of gluten here in the United States of wheat. It's a hybrid dwarf wheat, and it's designed to be pestilence resistant, so it doesn't spoil as easily. But in essence, it acts very differently than traditional other types of wheat. And there are a lot of people here in the United States that don't do well with that. Buckwheat, I do see buckwheat show up on occasion as a gluten-free alternative. And I think it can be a nice one, especially for people that maybe they want to make a buckwheat pancake or use it as a flour substitute. But here in the United States, there's a lot of underlying. It's called non-celiac gluten hypersensitivity, and there are a lot of people that are very sensitive to gluten, and they know this because when they go to Europe, they can eat the bread there and have no problems, which I think is really unfortunate. But having said that, I do find there's a lot of individuals that, it goes back to this hyper-processed, hyper-palatable, supply.
And buckwheat has a lot of fiber, so it's incredible for your gut health, right?
It should also be more filling than like this dwarf wheat variation.
So gluten, so oats basically, oatmeal is like poison, right?
Oat milk is crap. Oat milk is,
Not oat milk, but oatmeal.
Oatmeal. I think oatmeal is very bio-individual. I think that a lot of individuals don't understand the carbohydrate load that they're consuming. And so, like if my teenagers want to eat oatmeal, I don't have a problem with it because they're young and they have a lot of musculature on their body, a lot of insulin sensitivity. I think gluten with the caveat of portions are important. If you're sitting down and having 50 grams of carbohydrate, that's probably not going to make you feel too good. You're going to get this massive blood sugar response. And what I find is people don't just have the gluten, they don't just have the oatmeal, they have fruit on top of it, and then they put in like skim milk, which tends to be, more sugar laden than others, and then they're adding all these brown sugar and everything else. So it goes from being something that might have the potential with the degree of soluble fiber, might potentially be beneficial. They take it and they make it like a sugar bomb. And so that's always even if you think about Starbucks, if you get oatmeal at Starbucks, they give you brown sugar and raisins. And I'm like, okay, it went from, maybe being a healthier alternative than some of these other options, but now it is just as high in carbohydrates and sugar as, any of these other pastries or cakes that they have in their display case.
Yeah, but at the same time, you can have oatmeal without gluten, right? It's removed.
If it's certified, yes. It has to say certified.
But the way they do that, you like the way they do that? They remove the gluten?
Well, it's not that they remove the gluten. It's that it has to be on a processing plant that doesn't also process gluten. So it's saying that it's a separate facility. It's on separate machinery, so there's not cross-contamination. I'm just not a big fan. I don't love oatmeal, so to me it's not a big deal not to consume it. But I find a lot of people consume too much, or they put a lot on top of it that goes from being like good soluble fiber to suddenly it's now like having a sugar bomb.
Yeah, a 1,000-calorie meal.
Right.
With the peanut butter on top. Like, why? How can you eat that? Even for me, I'm a guy. Girls, like fitness girls, like doing those photos.
And they're probably 22.
Yeah.
No, when I was 22, I could eat whatever I wanted. Even when I was 32, I could eat whatever I wanted. So I get it. But I think the average person, even those acai bowls, it's the same thing. When I see them, I'm like, that's all. I mean, it's like all this sugar sweetened yogurt, and then they've got all this fruit on top of it. And I'm like, wow, there's not a lot of protein there.
So if you consume carbohydrates, you prefer what? Sweet potatoes, some fruits, some berries, some veggies?
Non-starchy veggies, yeah. I mean, personally, I just feel like those consistently work well for about all of my clients and patients. And it helps with, so think about protein, fat, and fiber is what we're looking for. That's really the magic formula. So if you sit down and have a steak, you've got broccoli, maybe you put some butter on your broccoli, or you sit down with a piece of fish and you add either some nuts or some avocado. Really helping people understand, like, when you stack your macros to your advantage, you're going to keep your blood sugar more stable. You're going to be more satiated. You're going to be able to walk away and feel fulfilled. You're not going to be like looking for that candy bar. And so it's not to suggest that I don't ever have any discretionary grains. Sometimes I go to a restaurant and there'll be a little bit of rice on a plate. I can tolerate that, but I don't gravitate towards rice. I don't gravitate towards bread. It's not something that I find problematic for me personally, but I do know plenty of my patients that really struggle. They really, really struggle with gluten and grains. Like, that is something that becomes challenging for them to eliminate.
Name me, please, top 10 poisonous foods right now on the market that people eat almost every day.
Oh, well, seed oil is number one. High fructose corn syrup. I would say...
yeah, but those are ingredients.
Yeah. Are you talking about just broad food-based?
Yes.
Gosh, I mean, I think this is very bio-individual. I think some of the things that I get concerned about are like gluten-free bread, gluten-free pasta, because intrinsically people assume it's healthier. Mm-hmm. And then you start looking at the ingredient list and you're like, that's not much better than the alternative. I think a lot of these like canned soups or these microwave meals, you start looking at what's inside them. A lot of these drinkable smoothies or drinkable yogurt drinks, I mean, they'll have 2 days worth of sugar in one teeny tiny little container. A lot of the protein bars, I'm not suggesting, I'm sure there are some good brands and I will occasionally talk about them publicly, but most of the protein bars are out there are like a glorified candy bar.
Name me at least one good protein bar.
There's a company called RAWR. It's RAWR. They're all handmade. I have no affiliation with them. It is a plant-based bar, but I mean, it's real food. Like, you have to refrigerate it. And you know, I've tried probably every flavor. They do taste good. I don't probably eat, if I were to use one or eat one, I wouldn't eat the whole bar. I'd probably eat half with something else.
No sucralose?
No, nope. They're totally clean. That's a company that I think highly of. Marigold is another company They have whey protein bars, but again, it's whole, real food. There's no junk in those. And they even have keto ones, so you can pick out the lower carb ones. But most protein bars, prepared protein shakes, same thing. There's junk and crap. If it's not the seed oils, it's the crappy sugars. If it's not that, it starts off with like the first ingredient is a date or oatmeal, and then it's like 30 grams of carbs in this teeny tiny little bar. I'm like, think about it as a dessert. If you want to think about it as a dessert, maybe that's reasonable, but I don't like those macros. A lot of the, they call them like no sugar or keto junk food, just in general, low carb junk food. It's a slippery slope. It's still junk food. Even if it has the paleo primal keto logo on it, it is still junk food. And lastly, I would say,
what about vegan ice cream?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I have a child who for a while needed to go dairy-free, and he probably sampled every coconut milk, cashew milk. Like, he had tried them all, and he had said the worst of them was the vegan ice cream. He said all of the other ones at least still tasted somewhat like ice cream. He actually said the cashew milk ones were the best. But having said that, I think it really comes down to just building awareness around what you're eating. I would say the other thing is, and I'm going to call out Whole Foods on this because I think it's a sin. Most of Whole Foods prepared foods are full of canola oil or soybean oil. And I'm not exaggerating. Like I was at Whole Foods this past week, and I was in the prepared food lines with one of my teenagers who was just looking for something to eat. And as I was looking, he's like, "Don't tell me, Mom. Just don't tell me." And I just said, pick what you want, or, get the greens or whatever, and I'll buy you a bottled dressing if there's something you want. There's a couple clean dressings that are out there, but most of what Whole Foods puts out there for their process, they're like prepared foods, which they look healthy.
But it's organic.
Yeah, they've got a deviled egg that they've already done for you, or they have a salad or whatever, or most of their stuff in their cases is full of seed oils. I'm like, Whole Foods, do better.
Yeah, that's 100%. That's for sure. What do you think of AI's meal plans?
AI's meal plans?
Yeah.
I don't know. I honestly haven't looked into them enough. I think just like when I tell my kids, if you think your teachers think you're creating original content from AI, you are mistaken. Do I think it's a starting place? I think for some people, they might be able to like plug into AI, like find a gluten-free, delicious homemade protein bar. I'm sure.
No. How to lose weight?
Oh, how to lose weight.
That's what the people are asking. I believe so.
Well, I've had women tell me that they are looking for recipe, like a specific recipe. They're looking for, because they're like, it'll be faster to search this way. I was like, really? I don't know. Because they're collating from all these different resources. Weight loss resistance in middle-aged women is weight loss resistance is the biggest pain point for my community. Like, what I used to do no longer works. Why doesn't it work? And what do I need to do? But there's no quick fixes. So I tell everyone. It's like you can AI it up the wazoo, but it does not mean you're going to find the answer for you through AI.
But the answer for all the humanity is just go lift some weight and eat raw food. Steaks, eggs, veggies.
But what I would say to you is the changes that occur in a woman's body in perimenopause and menopause, it is a wild ride. And so, yes, that is part of it. I think those are two things that you can do to your advantage. But by the same token, I would say that it's complicated. It's usually like 10 different things, and you have to pull every 10, like every lever has to be pulled at some point until you find out what's right. Like I tell everyone that going dairy-free was what got rid of the last 5 pounds of perimenopause. And I'm very open about that because I was doing everything right. Even saw like the best functional medicine person in my area. I was doing everything right. And even with that, it was something that seems very benign, but in my body created too much inflammation. And it took going through all of those different things. So yeah, strength training and eating clean absolutely make a big difference. But sometimes it's more than that.
Do you have an answer why some pregnant women vomit a lot, like every day? There's a friend of mine right here. He lives in LA. So his wife vomits, I want to say, for 3 to 4 months, like nonstop, every day.
Yeah, they call it hyperemesis gravidatum.
And they eat healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people are just more sensitive to being pregnant than others. I mean, I had friends who had to be hospitalized and get IV fluids, and they were. And in fact, I had one friend in particular that vomited the entirety of 2 pregnancies, and that's why she never had more children, because she said, I just couldn't deal with vomiting.
I wonder why.
That much. Right, exactly. I had terrible nausea, but it was just the first trimester. I can't imagine. That's unpleasant. But I think that some people's bodies are just much more sensitive to being pregnant than others. I don't know the research behind what drives that. I would imagine it's the constellation of, changes in hormones that are ongoing to support the pregnancy. And I think some people are just more sensitive. And I don't say that pejoratively. I'm just saying that objectively.
So, Cynthia, the last question on my podcast is always the same. Let's have 2 assumptions with you. Assumption number 1 is the most powerful human being on planet Earth is the President of the United States. Let's have an assumption. Not the current one, but just the position of it.
Okay.
Assumption number 2 is you become one. You become the President of the US. Once you do so, you've got this Secret Service. They come to you and they say, congratulations, we love you, we're on your side. We as a Secret Service know all the answers in the world. You can ask us whatever you want, we will give you an honest question, and that's going to be the truth. What would be your first question?
Oh, gosh. I think from my perspective, my first degree, I was a poli-sci major. So I have an undergraduate degree in foreign affairs and applied to law school and didn't go to law school. So for me, I've always had a curiosity about other countries and policies and politics. And so my question would be, what has transpired or happened that I've watched over my many years of being alive, where I feel like the United States has not been heading in a direction where we've been more inclusive and less polarizing. I feel like it has gotten more polarizing, more dogmatic. How do we navigate in this new world as what I think we're still a superpower, but I don't think we're the only superpower. How do we continue to grow and expand as a culture? Because when I look at other cultures, when I go to other countries, when I speak to other people, there's this curiosity about the United States. But yet when I'm here, I kind of look at things as like, I feel like we're devolving in a way. And how do we continue advancing as a culture and not kind of devolving? Like, I think people now, as an example, many younger people really look up to celebrities. Like when I was growing up, we looked up to authors and politicians and spiritual presence. Yes. And I feel like things have now devolved, and I don't know if it's the influence of like social media. This is a long response. Influence of social media or how our culture has started to devolve. But my curiosity, how do we get back on track?
Let's say they tell you that the enemy is within, that everything is on purpose. That's a plan. And they tell you, for instance, they give you 10 last names that are driving this narrative. You as a president of the US, would you expose it to the public?
Yes.
Really? Don't you think it's going to cause chaos?
I think it's the way in which you present the information. The one thing I've learned is that you can tell just about anyone anything. It's the way in which you share the information that counts. Not only in terms of them being able to accept what you're saying, but to be able to process it and create a way to move through it. So for me, I'm very much, and I'm this way in my business, I would rather someone be straight up honest with me than tell me something to make me feel good and then do something completely different.
So you think people can handle the truth?
I do. I think that we underestimate people.
Amen. Cynthia, thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and thank you for your energy.
Thank you for having me.
I like your vibe. I like the way that you speak, and the like that you're being unapologetic, saying the things that you really think. God bless you.
Thank you.
And come over to California more often.
I definitely will.
It's a great state.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.